Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. You will see in the studio we have a guest with us, William Thomson. He's been on several times before and we're delighted to have him back. So thanks for joining us, William.
Yep, thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
There's a few things we want to chat about, but the most important thing, I think, is news of a new Scottish economics conference coming up. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, most important for me, hopefully kind of interesting for the listeners as well. We've got a 3-day conference in Edinburgh, 19th, 20th, 21st. It's actually a festival. It's a 3-day festival. We've got sessions on Thursday night, Friday and Saturday. We've got 20 sessions in total. And it's about, you can concession ticket, £5.50, and you can make a little bit more of a contribution if you're able to for each of the session. On Thursday, we've got a couple of fantastic professors, one coming in online, one visiting us from Texas University, professor. It's a wonderful, John Harvey is one of my favourite professors. He's joining us in person on Thursday. And then on Friday, we've got a full day starting at 12 o'clock. And we have 7 or 8 sessions on the Friday. And then on Saturday, we start again at 12 o'clock, right through until 10 o'clock. Lots of really interesting, very different stuff. We're talking about the impact of Trump and democracy. We're looking at why we only really hear one economic narrative, and we all think it's a kind of a different narrative, but it's actually the same narrative. We've got a couple of sessions trying to explain austerity and the impact of fiscal rules. We're looking at the well-being economy. We're looking at land. So we're trying to cover as much as we can over 3 days, but with a few kind of consistent themes. That there is an alternative to what we hear, why it's so important to link the economy with democracy, and realizing that every economic decision is actually a political decision. And we kind of finish with, I think, the real strongest theme, which is to explain to people that austerity is a choice and that governments can do so much more with the power we've got. At the moment, we've sold 250 tickets. We're hoping to get to 1,000, which would be absolutely amazing. But we're doing really well, and we're really glad of the support so far. We've had 10 organisations support us as well, so they're bringing along speakers and helping us with promotion, including the We All Alliance, the Democracy Collaborative, David Graeber Institute, The Breakdown, which is a wonderful climate magazine and website, the Adam Smith Global Foundation, and a few others. So it's been great to get some support within Scotland and also outside. So it's a real kind of festival. It's really informal. We're expecting people to be talking about the economy in ways that everyone understands. It's not jargon heavy, it's not technical or overly technical in any way, and it really is designed to try and get as many people to the festival as possible to understand that there is an alternative, and not to be so depressed about the way the economy is, because the power lies with us and our ability to change it.
Oh, wow. That sounds a little, maybe we should get you just to repeat all that again, because I'm sure no one else will have taken it in completely. But it just, because you've run, day or weekend conferences, even festivals, before, but this sounds like you've really broadened it out.
Yeah, well, I did the Scotonomics festival for a few years, and it was just myself, and I was doing it while I was studying for my master's, so it was always part-time. Whereas this year, I've been able to say, right, okay, I can dedicate a few months to making sure that this is exactly the type of topic that we want to cover. Just so trying to get things as kind of current as possible, but also trying to think about, what are the things that people really need to know to understand that the situation that we've got at the moment in Scotland and in the UK is primarily driven because there's a certain view of the economy which explains to policymakers how things work. And as I said, there's a lot of alternatives, but I'm trying to give the public an alternative and say, there's tens of thousands of incredibly intelligent professors, associate professors, academics, economists, political economists who believe the economy works this way. And when you believe it works differently, when your description of the economy is different and the problems is different, you come up with different prescriptive elements to it, so you don't look at, reducing prices. Maybe you look at incentivizing through some other different way, or maybe you're talking about rent controls. So there's a whole different approach that you can take to the economy. And I think it is really timely. It's only, I think it's about 6 weeks before the Holyrood election. So hopefully it'll help people be much more considered about who they vote as well, who they vote for as well. We've got a really good good website called scotonomics.org, and it gives you all of the individual sessions. You can also buy a ticket just for the Thursday or the Friday or the Saturday, and we've also got an online ticket. So if you can't make it to Edinburgh, we've actually sold a few tickets to America this year because of some of the topics that we're covering. So if you can't make it to the event, there's an online ticket you can watch live, but you also got all of the recordings as well. So all the tickets are available online, scotonomics.org.
Brilliant. We'll put the link in the notes under the podcast as well.
Are you both coming along?
Of course, yes. Probably not for all 3 days, but
we'll cherry pick. We'll look at the sessions and see which one. But I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about helping people realize there's different ways of thinking about how you run an economy or how to do it. And I mean, I spotted. I think it was just yesterday. It was a headline in an email I got, and it's the head of the UN, Guterres. He's saying the world has got to get thinking beyond in terms of GDP. It's ruining the planet. We've got to get beyond that. And I mean, probably not, no surprise that he'd say that. I mean, the UN has its own, whole climate bunch of people, and they've got economists who are helping them, do that. And yet, usually what you hear about in, BBC, mainstream media is how the GDP is doing or how inflation's doing. So have you got any favourites, William, that you're really looking forward to?
At the festival, I think the John Harvey, who classes himself as the cowboy economist, he's coming over from Texas, and he's speaking on the Thursday night. And he was my professor when I studied my my last masters, and he's wonderful. He's one of those people that you just wish you were sitting next to at a dinner table. He's just so full of wonderful anecdotes. He's a really, really funny guy. He's a great communicator, and he's incredibly smart. He's probably the world authority on business cycles, what happens to an economy when it's rising and then falls and then comes back again. And he also wrote a wonderful book called Contending Perspectives in Economics, and that was one of my favorite modules we did as part of his course. And basically he just said, hey, there's something called neoclassical economics, and this is how they view the world, but there's also something called feminist economics. Here's their view. Here's ecological economists' view, and now here's post-Keynesians' views. What about a new institutionalist? How do they look at the world? So it explains, not all of them, but a good chunk of the different schools of economics. And after that course, I remember thinking, this should be the course that every single economics student starts with. Instead, what they get is someone said, here's how the economy works. There's a supply curve, there's a demand curve, there's an interaction. The price is set here. When the price is set here, all the goods are sold and all the demand's satisfied. Okay, great. We'll now go to how does a business work? Well, a business decides how much marginal profit it wants, and it sets the figure here. Right. So it just instantly, when you do any economics course at university, and this is, something we'll maybe return to, but every single economics course throws you into neoclassical economics, and that's all that it covers. It never mentions ecological economics or institutionalism or Marxism or post-Keynesian or feminism. And you just, at the end of that course, you think, wow, I can cherry pick a lot of brilliant ideas from all these different schools. So he's going to bring that to life on the Thursday, and then we're going to end the session with our session that I did when I was running the Scotonomics Festival, which is our Mythbuster. We look at 10 things that most people think is true about our economy, and then we kind of explain them from this kind of heterodox alternative view. So I'm really looking forward to the Thursday, and I think once the Thursday's over, we'll be straight into the Friday and then into the Saturday.
Yeah,
one of the things I really love about that kind of approach is that everything you hear in mainstream media, it's all about making money. It's all about making a few people richer. And there's so many other reasons why economics is important, as you've just reeled off there, but the sort of well-being of the planet, the health of the people on it, what the point of being alive, really. It's not just all to make a few rich white guys even richer. But,
have you come across books that are probably courses as well that Diane Cole has written? She's a economics professor at Cambridge in the Bennett Institute. So she's got books that are got titles like The Economics of Enough, and which I now have a copy of, but I haven't actually have to admit it's sitting on the shelf, and I haven't really got into it very much. But what actually struck me is other articles of hers that I've read is that she sort of sounds like she's an economist with a social conscience, and she's not just thinking. I mean, she's also got another book which she's called, which is about the end of GDP, something like that. So she obviously thinks outside the box, although she's in herself. She's a professor at Cambridge. She's a dame something or other. And
Danny Dorling's a professor at Oxford.
Yeah.
We love Danny.
And he's a heterodox economist as well. So he's similar to myself, and possibly that lady that you mentioned as well, who I haven't come across, is a heterodox economist, or within that kind of space. When you're a solid heterodox economist like me, there's a few people you can kind of stretch across into kind of neoclassical and kind of pool, and you've got enough kind of in common. Mark Blyth's a really good example. Mark Blyth's a Scottish, he's born in Dundee, but he's now a professor at Brown's University, and he's a fairly mainstream, but he's someone with a heart, and he wants to see the best in an economy, and you can kind of pull that across, and he understands that if you just put the price of something up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the supply is going to go down. If you spend loads of money on marketing, for example, then people will still buy. So he understands the kind of real world. And that's really what we hope to cover at the festival. And we say we're bringing big economic ideas to Scotland. That's really what we want to do. We don't want to get caught in the kind of minutiae. Too much of the mainstream economic narrative is about what should interest rates be 3.25% or 3%? Should the lowest tax band be 20% or 19%? And we're going to talk about, do you need tax? What if you didn't allow the market to control the price of electricity? A lot of really kind of like big ideas. What if the state got back to what it used to do in the 1970s? How would that affect the economy? And as you said, Marlene, what about if we stopped chasing GDP? So we're trying to look at these big problems, because I think we would all agree that just trying to solve these huge problems by just like gently kind of chipping away makes no impact at all. And we really do need radical change. And obviously that's one of the reasons why I'm such a strong supporter of Scottish independence, because it gives us the opportunity to do that better than anything else, really.
Are you going to invite any members of the Scottish Government to attend the conference? Because we've touched on this before, haven't we, Marlene, in recent episodes, that you've got so many people doing so much really good work, and yet not engaging or not being engaged with the actual people who are able to use some of this. And it's such a waste of resource for them. It's get round a table, but it seems to be very hard to encourage them into the room.
How I see my role is I do a few different things, and I am regularly speaking to Scottish Government ministers now, and the chief economist and senior civil servants, and I do that. I had a meeting with an MSP last week to talk about something we're hoping to do in Parliament in the new election. So that's I've got a kind of one-to-one or a very different way of approaching the policymakers. This festival is for the general public. And I really want to empower people to then go to their policymakers or whoever's representing them. But we want to give people enough information for them to be able to make decisions about how they vote, in the hope that they are going to, provide that much more challenge for their elected representatives. We decided not to include any politicians this year because it's 6 weeks before the election, and we were worried about kind of a purdah and all of those issues. But certainly they've all been invited to attend this year.
Well, they can watch it online, I suppose. I mean, I suspect we're finding that it's very difficult to get any time in anybody's diary because they are so busy, and that's understandable.
Well, we know there's several prospective MSP candidates coming to the festival. So we know that for sure, because those are the ones that I'm in quite in close contact with. So hopefully we'll have a few more from the other parties as well. But as I said, that's not really the focus. It is explaining to people that there is an alternative, and demonstrating that and giving them evidence and empowering them to start to demand much larger change in their society.
Fiona and I recently, we were listening to some of the discussions that took place at one of the committees at Holyrood. It's a Constitutional Affairs Committee, and we're talking about independence isn't just one act or one event. it's a whole process before it. Then there's an event of some sort, and then there's another whole process. So they got into talking about how important the process before the, say, a referendum, if that's what it was, is. How do you make that be perceived by people who don't get the answer that they wanted? Nevertheless, the process was fair, and they'll go with that. They'll go, okay, I didn't want this, but I recognise most people did, and it was a fair process. And then they'll be able to feel, more like engaging afterwards. So it was a really interesting discussion that kind of arose in this. I'm now thinking, well, something like this, a festival for Scottish economics going forward, looking at it a bit broader, that could well be a really good part to have in the run-up to a referendum, because as you say, it's educating people, it's giving people good information, and it's allowing people then to go to, a unionist or a nationalist, spokesperson and say, well, okay, but what about this and what about that? So yeah. I just think it's just such a good move to have broadened it out like that.
I hope that we're here. I hope that we do a few more, but whether or not we do enough to lead us into the next referendum campaign, I'm not sure we're going to be around for long enough for that. We'll have to see when that happens and how it arrives. But
that sounds like you're a little bit pessimistic about the length of time, whereas I'm already planning who's going to be in the Scottish Winter Olympics team in 4 years' time.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right.
Isn't it refreshing that Zack Polanski seems to be speaking much more your language, and yet how frustrating that the mainstream media response to it is ridicule? I just kind of wonder is this a vote winner or a vote loser?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've met Zack a few times, and I would be as bold to say I've briefed him on a couple of issues. This was before Christmas, and we were aligned in so many ways. And Zack spoke on a panel down in London at UCL, which I chaired October 23, I think, for the MMT film Finding the Money, and it's online, and you should drop the link because it's a wonderful discussion after this film. And Zack and I got on really well. We clearly see we both want the same type of economy, and he's got a real understanding of how monetary operations work. And he's clear that taxes don't pay for government spending, and that the government chooses to borrow, it doesn't need to borrow. And when I had the conversation with him, I said to him, you got to be so careful though, because what you're saying is so different that you've got to have a level of knowledge that allows you to come back when someone says something and say to them, that's not actually how it works. And that's incredibly complicated for someone who also needs to be on NATO and the United Nations and child poverty and education and health and travel. And, as a politician, he's got to be effectively an expert in so many areas. And what we're trying to do as a kind of heterodox community is inform and educate Zack and people like Zack to a point where, they're able to come back when someone says to them, well, the bond markets decide, which is a common response. And I've been saying to Zack, he needs to be able to say to someone, sorry, which bond markets? And he has to have that confidence. And then the interview, whoever it would be, well, the long-term bond markets, and say, do you mean 30-year gilt market? And you've got to have that level of knowledge to be able to really challenge, because it's not too difficult, because the people who are interviewing you, they're just given these talking points, and they say things like, well, the government debt's at 1 trillion or 1.5 trillion. So that means we can't spend anything. But if you say, well, actually, the government debt's got a flip side, that's 1.5 trillion of people's personal savings. So the government's debt is the private sector's asset. So, you need to look at both sides, so these are things that are really complicated and difficult to do. But Zack's trying. I've got a huge amount of respect for him, and he's doing incredibly well if you look at the polls. So I really hope it is a vote winner, because we do need much more radical policies, and parties in Scotland and the Green Party in the UK need to offer policies which are much more radical, and Zack gets it.
Yeah.
I heard Laura Kunsberg one Sunday morning, and she was talking to him, and he said something, and I was listening. I thought, oh, that sounds like that sounds like the kind of thing that William talks about. And so I was immediately aware he'd said something that was unusual about looking after money. And she didn't really pursue him that much. But then she got back to her panel. She always has a panel of about 3 people. And she's saying, well, what did you think about that? And 2 of them immediately jumped in and ridiculed him and said, well, he obviously doesn't know anything about how money works, does he? And I thought afterwards, that's what you're up against, isn't it? She didn't pursue him, presumably because she might know well enough that she wasn't able to. But then the program is such that it then gives space to people just jump in and laugh at him, actually. And I've remembered both things from the program. So I'm more inclined to think that he knows what he's saying, especially now that I know that you've mentored him, William. Because that's a stretch. That's a stretch. I know that's a stretch. He's probably well able to understand that himself.
No, it is a good point. But reform speak absolute nonsense, but lots of people vote for them, right? And I'm not saying in any way that Zack's saying nonsense, but just what I'm saying is that you can challenge the mainstream narrative and people will vote for you. Unfortunately, that Zack's narrative is the kind of good stuff, making it much more safe and have much more of a progressive relationship with people who are forced to come to the United Kingdom. Really think about how you reduce the purchasing power of the wealthiest in society. How we start managing our economy to buttress less against our planetary boundaries. All of that. So he is saying all of this stuff. He is talking about well-being and not GDP. So he's incredibly challenging for a mainstream, and I think a lot of people are excited by that.
What you were saying there, Marlene, they just come back with a sort of a reply they've been given, and they don't really understand what they're talking about. They're just coming up with, here's my notes from the program. And we had an example of that, was The Rest is Politics. Similarly, talking about Zack, and what's his name, Rory, had just said, well, it's a shame he hasn't bothered to learn anything about how money works.
I know, it's so funny. My partner's a big fan of the kind of mainstream podcasts and stuff, and she said, you'll have to listen to this. And I listened to Rory speaking about MMT, which is modern monetary theory, which Zack was talking about. And Rory said, well, I spent 5 hours, digging deep into MMT, right? And I thought, wow, I've been studying MMT for 8 years, right? Right, and I still don't know everything, and I have a master's in economics of sustainability based on MMT, and I've read hundreds of papers on MMT, and he's done 5 hours, and he genuinely thought that was enough for him to be able to say, well, I looked at and it's rubbish, and it's so condescending. And I feel I'm able to criticize the mainstream economics because I studied at university for a year, and then I live in a society where it's just predominantly about how the mainstream sees the economy. And before you become a heterodox economist, that's why we say we're a lot smarter, right? Before you become a heterodox economist, you have to learn neoclassical economics, and then you have to learn how to deconstruct it, and then you have to create a new type of economics. So I feel I'm able to criticize it, but Rory isn't able to do that, and it's thoroughly embarrassing that someone thinks they can spend an afternoon and can completely understand a whole school of economics. I mean,
me and Marlene have spent longer than that. We've been to the Scottish Currency Group. We've been to Scotonomics. We know more than that.
You ask a lot better questions about it than he does as well. But it is undeniably, it is, to get into the detail is very complicated, but the basics of it are fairly simple, and once people grasp that, then they are able to move on. The huge problem is that I could spend an hour with any of the listeners or with you two, and I could kind of persuade you that my view of the economy, and it makes sense and it's logical, and you say, oh yeah, I never really thought about who has that government debt, whose is that, and where does it come from, what would happen if you pay it off? So we can have all of these discussions, and it's happened to me dozens of times now, and at the end of it someone said, oh yeah, I really see where you're coming from. But they go home and they see Laura Kuenssberg, or they see everyone else, they read in the mainstream, and then you've got my one well-constructed, thought-out narrative, right, against 100 or 1,000 that they hear, and their mates say, oh, that's nonsense. How can the government just print money? That'll cause loads of inflation. And that's it. So it's so difficult, and it's why we really need to keep to keep kind of pounding on that door, and we need more people to talk about it, because the basics are really simple and really intuitive, I think, when you get to it. But that's the big challenge, and Zack is really helping us kind of go over that, because people are saying, oh, he said something that I've kind of heard before from somewhere, and he's the leader of our political party, so I'm going to look into that. It's a really good reinforcer for a lot of people who are in the space.
Do you get the feeling then, if you're having discussions with people in the Scottish government, do you think that they are similarly open to it? Are you having to push against a closed door, or are they up for it?
It's a wonderful position to be in, because every progressive MSP I've met, so that's Green and SNP, they want the same type of society that I want. So if I was meeting with MPs from other parties, you can fill that bit in, and I'm saying, I want a much fairer and a more just society. Other MSPs or MPs say, no, I don't want that type of society. People should be working a lot harder to get that. But most of all the progressive MSPs are saying to me, that's exactly how I want society to work. So I'm saying, great, we agree that. Here's how you get there. That's not caught up in this kind of neoliberal, neoclassical, you need to raise tax and you need to worry about the bond markets, and that GDP is a great thing. So it's like an open door, because they want to get to the type of society, and I'm saying to them, here's how you do that. Here's a much kind of more well-being led, resilience led way to do that. So the response is really good, but you really struggle. Now I'm moving up, speaking to ministers, to get them to understand the level of change that they need to embrace if they actually want to create this type of society. And that's the big challenge. But all the MSPs who are not ministers, and there's a lot of them in the Parliament who are really disappointed with this administration, and there's a lot of new MSPs who are going to be much more challenging, not just on independence, but on a progressive Scotland that I think it is going to be a really different intake in the next Holyrood election, and I'm expecting it to be a much more radical body of MSPs.
Well, that could be really good, couldn't it? We were in an interview where Ivan McKee was the guest. And we've podcasted it. It was Pensioners for Indy. And we had hoped to get into some discussion with him about some of these things, because he doesn't appear to be a fan at all of modern monetary theory. But unfortunately, the conversation kind of went down a rabbit avenue, shall we say.
He is a minister, and one of his responsibilities is public finance, and I sort of thought I was sort of annoyed with myself actually afterwards for not kind of intervening a bit more and asking a question there.
Scotland doesn't create its own currency, and so I don't have conversations with ministers about MMT because it's irrelevant. Right, modern monetary theory is all about how the government taxes and spends, and what happens with bonds, and this whole kind of institutional framework around the creation of a currency. That's irrelevant in Scotland as it is at the moment. So my conversations with ministers are about the things that they're doing now, and how we can improve the wealth and the health of what we call the non-domestic private sector, which is me, you, me, both of you, every household, every business. How can we make it easier for them? People would be saying kind of cost of living crisis, that type of stuff. So that's where all my work goes on. And there's a particular example that I would like to cover. But yes, absolutely. If you take that step back, and I say to them, look, if you're thinking about what you need to do in the economy of an independent Scotland, you're not going to get there by being UK light. Right? You're not going to get there by what's called grandfathering, which is starting from a position where you take all of the regulations that are in England at the moment, and you say, right, this is how we're going to start. We're going to start with all of the company law that's currently in England. And then we're going to change it through Parliament, which is never a quick process. And then we're going to get it. The same with taxation, with corporation tax. We're going to start with the same level of corporation tax in England. We're going to start with the same corporate governance. We're going to start with the same financial regulation as they have at the moment, right? And this is the plan. And then what we are saying is, actually, if you understand how institutions develop, the most important thing that any institution does is set itself up to replicate some other form of institution, right? As soon as it decides what type of institution it wants to start, how difficult do you think it is to completely change that type of institution? It's incredibly challenging. So what we're saying to the Scottish government is, no, don't grandfather anything. Set up right from the start and say, okay, we want our central bank to do A, B, C, and D. Great. Let's set up that institution. We want our corporation tax to be completely different. Great. How do we set it up? And obviously, you can take a little bit of current regulation from where we are at the moment, or where we would be when we were independent. But it's really to think about how you can start to tailor institutions to make them fit the Scottish context. That's a huge challenge. And what we see continually when I speak to ministers is that they just say, no, we just need to get a little bit more foreign direct investment, or we just need to tax slightly different. And everything's around kind of tweaking. And I think the Scottish population are crying out and saying, no, we want something completely different. The reason that we want independence is to do something completely different. I don't want UK Light. I don't want a privatised health service. I want my electricity generated by my community. I don't want to have to pay a huge amount to a private firm who makes profits. I want the state to be involved in some way of my electricity generation. But if you look at the last two prospectuses, the 2022 prospectus and the A Fresh Start with Independence, neither of them talk about nationalisation. They don't even talk about privatisation. You would just imagine someone would say privatisation has been an absolute disaster for the Scottish economy, specifically for the poorest households in our country. So we are going to make sure that if anything's privatised, it stays privatised. It has to give us value. Nothing negative said about one of the most damaging processes that's happened in the UK in the last 40 years. And this is an example of the level of expectation that I'm expecting of a SNP-led administration when or if we became independent. They're not aware of the size of the challenge.
I didn't know it was called grandfathering. But I mean, it's interesting because one of the currency group days that we were at, there was a talk about banking regulations, and I'd thought, oh, maybe I'll just go away and not sit into that one. But anyway, I ended up being there and listening to it, and actually I did find it quite fascinating. But he was doing that. He was saying, look, we'll start from where we are, and we'll take those regulations. That's a good idea because it's people don't get spooked. Markets, investors won't get spooked, but then we'll gradually change them because we will, of course, want to run our banks differently, so we'll gradually change them. Now, it was pretty convincing as far as I was concerned, but I can see that there's a bit of a difficulty, isn't there? Because, I mean, you have to have a mandate for a political party or parliament has to have a mandate, so then you have a referendum. Okay, well, we're going to start negotiations. We've done it. We'll start negotiations on independence. At some point, there needs to be an election, and then we elect whoever. You pick the one who's got those kind of things in their manifestos. But timing it is tricky, isn't it? You don't want to have a hiatus when the markets don't know what's going on and start getting.
Well, Okay. Some really interesting points. I do not give a flying F about the market, right? I'm much more concerned about the average person in Scotland who can't pay their bills. And if Scotland has its own currency, it's able to decide if it wants to borrow money. So it can go to the market, and I'm trying to say this in as kind of clear and simple a way as possible, but the Scottish government, when it's independent, and if it has its own currency, the Scottish government creates its own currency. It's impossible to borrow private finance. You just cannot do it. It's impossible for a government to borrow private finance. A government can only borrow money that is previously spent into the economy. So effectively, it's borrowing the money that is previously spent. It's borrowing its own money. That's the only way that any government can borrow, because it can only borrow what's effectively deficit spending, money that it's spent and it's not taxed back. I said, I don't want to go to be too technical at all, but when you have a new government that creates currency, it spends it and it doesn't have to borrow it because it's spending it. it can decide to borrow or it cannot decide to borrow. And if you go to the markets, okay, and I'll use that term, I hate using that term, but I'll use it because I think people understand it. But if you go to the market and you say, here's a government bond and it's paying you 2%, and if the market says, we don't want that, the government can say, fine, we don't need your money. We're just giving you an opportunity to save with us at an interest rate that's higher than the interest rate that we give you for your money that's left in the bank account at the Scottish Central Bank. And then people say, well, hold on a minute, but they need the money. They don't need any money, and you can't borrow money that the government hasn't spent yet. So it just completely changes the understanding of how government financing works. And this is a position that Scotland will be in. It will be spending its new money, and it'll say, hey, we want pension funds to have a secure asset that they know are going to get 3% in 5 years' time. So here's a government bond. And who wants it? Great. Primary dealers, which are the commercial banks that will be members of the monetary system in Scotland, will buy that bond because they're getting more interest than they get in their current account, which sits at the Scottish Central Bank. They buy that bond and then they sell it to within the market to people who want to diversify their investment portfolio. Right. This is the market of which we are so scared, because people don't understand what government finance is. And this is an absolute crucial point for people to understand, is that if Scotland uses sterling, it continues to use sterling, then everything I've said is completely out the window. We do have to borrow. We have to borrow from the Bank of England, or we have to borrow from primary and like investment people who have got pounds that they can borrow, that they can lend to us. It's a fundamentally huge different position to be in, and that's where there's a complete lack of understanding in the Scottish government. They just assume that using sterling is just a bit like using your own currency, and you couldn't be further from the truth. And my concern is that we have this independence, this vision for an independent Scotland, built on a complete misunderstanding of how government finances work. And if you don't understand that, then you start worrying about fiscal deficits and trying to gain a surplus and all of these things, which will absolutely torpedo Scottish independence.
Seems to have torpedoed Rachel Reeves at the moment, isn't it? Because it's what she's got caught up in, for the way that they do it.
And this is why, you know, and when we started, Marlene, you were talking about how independence has to start early, right? And this is exactly the case. Independence should be starting now. We should be thinking about the types of institutions that we want to create now, and we're not in the Scottish government. And when you don't do that, someone like Rachel Reeves, who might be the nicest, best chancellor in the world, gets caught up in the institutions. Right, and she gets caught up in the institutions, and she says to someone, "You know, I want to do a big spending plan." But because you've set up an institution, which is the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, who get to sign off, then they say, well, we won't sign it off. And she's like, oh, damn you, I want to spend, but you won't. But this is the institutional construction. None of this is economic law. None of this is just economic opinion. The reason that the OBR exists is to make sure that the government don't spend a lot of money helping people who really need it. That's the reason d'etre of it. That's why it's there. And you will find in the OBR, it will say our job is to make sure that government's day-to-day spending is paid for by tax revenue. That just means our job is to make sure that the poorest people in society don't get their fair share. And that's the institutional setup. And that's what the Scottish government wants to do when we become independent. And these things are hugely worrying for people who understand monetary operations and how you finance government.
You said something about earlier on about the two papers that had come out of the government. And I kind of wonder if that is right from the beginning. That's where we're going wrong, is expecting a government which is trying to run a country of also coming up with the options for something that's going to happen at some point in the future. I mean, right now, as you say, should be the time that I like government by independence by to-do list. You know, here's a list of all the things we have to do. Here's all the institutions. Here's where all the groups that we have to set up. And that's the kind of thing that you could imagine citizens' assemblies or, you know, expert panels of differing views, and get some real deliberative stuff going. And actually, why should we expect the government to come out with all the decisions on things that they, as you said, they may know very little about. It might be one of a million things they've got to keep across. They're not going to know it in depth. So that's my frustration, is that it just doesn't feel very organized or very strategic.
Yeah, there's not enough resource. So I know where you're coming from, and I've got friends who are senior civil servants, and I know how stressed they are and overworked they are. And there's not the resource there. There's not enough resource really for them to be managing the country as it is now, never mind also planning the country in the future. But they've got a lot more resources than we have.
Yeah,
they need to be funding it, and it'd be really, they're so scared. We've just got a little puppy in our house, and the SNP government are like a little puppy. You drop something and they just start like that. They're just so scared. Or the Daily Mail have said something, or Laura Kuenssberg said something, and they're just so scared. And I don't think they've got the intellectual capacity to be able to stand up and argue all of these points. And I think that's been a weak part of the Scottish government for certainly 5 years, if not longer. And these are really, really difficult. They find it impossible why they can't come out and say we are dedicating £1 million to the future plan for Scottish independence, and we're paying researchers across the world to come up with great ideas because it's a possibility and it's what we want.
Not outsourcing it to Charlotte Street Partners either.
Or Ernst & Young. The one thing I did want to cover was just and very briefly a little bit of work that myself and Jim Osborne from the Scottish Currency Group have done. So the Scottish government have decided that it'd be a really good idea for the Scottish government to release bonds, so Scottish government bonds. So we think it's quite a good idea. Currently, the Scottish government can borrow up to about $3 billion over the Parliament, and it's not a huge amount of money. It's a tiny percentage of our GDP, but they borrow $3 billion, and they borrow that from the National Loans Fund. So they go to Westminster and they say, "Can we borrow for investment?" And Westminster says, yes, it's in the fiscal framework, but it has to be signed off by the Secretary of State for Scotland. But he signs it off, right, because it's his duty to sign it off. So Scotland borrows £3 billion and we invest it in infrastructure. And then at the end of 5 years, we pay a tranche of it back. And at the end of 10 years, we pay all of it back, right? And the Scottish government said, it'd be quite good if we could just kind of maybe change that relationship a little bit and maybe borrow less from the National Loans Fund. And we're thinking this is a really good idea. It almost looks like we're trying to separate our finances from Westminster. And they've decided that they'll now borrow 1.5 billion from international capital markets. So they're going to go to Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank and JP Morgan and maybe some of the hedge funds and say, can we borrow 1.5 billion over 10 years? And we've said, this is a terrible idea. This is a terrible idea. Why are you doing that? And they're saying, well, for the reasons we want to kind of diversify our borrowing. And we've said, it's only 1.5 billion, right? So why don't you go to the Scottish public or local authority pension funds and say, Scottish government bonds paying 4% interest. We're looking to raise 1.5 billion, but we're just going to go to the Scottish public. And they've said that they researched this a little bit and then decided against it. So we've done a couple of freedom of information requests, and it's revealed some things that I really find absolutely shocking. But the first thing to kind of explain is that Credit Suisse are going to lend the Scottish government 1.5 billion pounds, okay, as an example, but they get 165 million pounds of interest payments back. So 165 million pounds interest payment. So that goes from the Scottish government's budget to Credit Suisse, right? If they borrow from the Scottish public, where does that 165 million go?
Back
into
to
the
us.
economy.
And then we spend it. Yeah.
Yes.
We spend it.
So they have made a decision, and it's a rough calculation about 165 million, but they have made a decision that 165 million is better given to international financial capital than it is to strengthen the private sector, right? The non-domestic private sector. And we find that absolutely unbelievable, considering right now they're passing a community wealth building bill through Parliament.
Yeah.
Which is all about strengthening community. But the really important point I want to make specifically about Scottish independence is we said to them, okay, you've got this bond and it might be 10 years. Can you show us where you considered what would happen if Scotland becomes independent? Right? Because if I'm borrowing for 10 years and I'm the Scottish government, and one of my big priorities is Scotland being independent, do I make sure that this bond issuance, I'm able to deal with that if Scotland becomes independent? What would you say?
Well, you'd hope they'd say yes, of course.
Of course. And they said there was no consideration of the constitutional issues around independence in the issuance and discussion on this bond.
Oh, well, that's telling, isn't it?
None at all. So I'm constantly looking for examples where I see the Scottish government acting in what it says and them not being two different things. And this for me, I don't want to over-egg it, but this for me is a bit of a smoking gun, because they have said, and we got this from a senior civil servant, and we've got this from our freedom of information requests, that there was no consideration. Because what we've said is, if you have a retail bond, you say to people as part of the contract, if Scotland becomes independent, right, we'll pay you back in Scottish pounds rather than English pounds. And if you don't want that, fine. But if you borrow pounds and it's not in the contract, you want pounds back. So this weakens the Scottish government's position. There's a whole host of reasons and why a retail bond's better. But for me, Jim and I were absolutely shocked when they said there was no consideration of what would happen if we were independent or if we had our own currency.
Yeah.
Is that just that they've been too busy to think about it, it didn't occur to them, or that they've actually thought, ooh, is this a possibility? Nah, not going to happen in 10 years, carry on.
Well, either of those are terrible, aren't they? It's not like
they are.
It's very much the same idea about the whole foreign direct investment, though, where all the money, all the profits are flowing offshore, and how much of our assets are not owned by us. At some point, that's going to come home to roost as well.
I think that's a really good example, because often I'm thinking, come on, Holyrood, or come on, any of the independent supporting MSPs, or they're doing a deal, or Westminster's doing a deal for something that actually will affect us as an independent. I sort of think, well, God, why aren't you out there saying, hey guys, you've just done a deal with Great Britain. Remember that when we're independent, that will be null and void, and we'll be coming back to you with a different conversation. And it's like, even if that means nothing just now, kind of, but it gets a certain conversation out, gives it a bit of publicity, it gives it a bit of life.
It makes it real,
and it does make it real. And I mean, that one, I suspect it's probably, whoever's been thinking through about the Scottish bond, they probably just don't have the bandwidth to do the deeper level of thinking properly. I wouldn't say it was kind of anyone saying, no, we'll not bother, it won't be independent.
Yeah, well, we've got freedom of information requests that show that it was someone saying, oh, we won't bother, right? And we have gone to such a level of detail that we're able to evidence this. And Jim and I are writing a paper, which we hope to have out in about a month's time, which kind of explains this in real detail, because it's shocking. But the Scottish government said, right, we need to, we want to change how we borrow. So we're going to set up an investors panel. And onto that investors panel, we're going to invite all of the big major banks, wholesale banks, and we're going to say to them, how should Scotland borrow? And they went, why don't you borrow from wholesale banks? Right? So this is almost the institutional malaise. And what's clear is that they have said, well, we want to borrow from the wholesale market, so let's invite a panel of people from the whole. So they're deciding on what's best because they've got an assumption that Scotland needs to attract, and this is me being as favourable as I can, they've got an assumption that Scotland needs to attract more foreign direct investment. If Scotland has a bond issuance, then the Scottish government, then it'll attract more foreign direct investment. But we looked at the research, we looked at the evidence, and even from the Scottish government, it says, yeah, but there's no evidence that that'll actually happen. If you want to invest in a chemicals plant in Falkirk, right, and you're a business based in Sweden, you go over to Falkirk and you look and you see what's there, and you look at the market around and you think where you can sell those products, and you look at the staff and you look at the history and you look at your experiences and who wants to move from Sweden to Falkirk, and you sort all that out and you go, we'll invest. You don't say, oh, the Scottish government have released 1.5 billion in bonds, therefore we're going to invest in this company in Falkirk. Yeah. It's complete nonsense. There's no connection. And the Scottish government evidence said, we can't even stretch it for there to be evidence. So even on their own metric, this is a terrible decision. And we're going to have politicians, they need to stand up and say, we decided to give £165 million of public money to Credit Suisse or JP Morgan instead of injecting it back into the economy because A, B, C, and D. And I've challenged Ivan McKee on this twice now, formally in letter, and he's refused to come back and give us an answer. And we need people who listen to these podcasts to demand that politicians stand up for their actions and explain why they're making these decisions, because they look so terrible for any perspective that really shows that they're thinking about the public sector or people like me and you two.
An equality impact assessment they have to do before they pass any bit of legislation. And there's a dozen other environmental assessments. Why is future, constitutional change should also be something that it's tested against, even if the answer is, if we do this, it'll stop us being independent, then that should tell them something. If the answer is, if we're independent, this is going to fall apart, that should tell them something. Or if it is, if we become independent, we've built in some planning so that this is what will happen then and there. That should be bread and butter, I think. Do it for equality impact assessments and everything. They could do it for that as well.
That's what you would expect, and I'm going to leave this as an open statement. That's what you would expect from an administration that truly wants Scottish independence.
Just to put a bit of context, because, it seems like a pretty much a no-brainer, right? Why put that 165 million, the interest from that loan, and give it to whoever it is, Chase Morgan, as opposed to put it in such a way that it gets spent back into the Scottish economy? That seems a complete no-brainer. But just for context, if you look at other countries who are issuing their own bonds, is that the normal way to do it, to offer it to their own citizens, or at least institutions in their own countries? Is that how it's normally done?
Well, Scotland's a sub-national government. So we are not the same as all of these other governments because they issue a bond in their sovereign currency. If you loan me money and I owe you 1.5 billion, right, which is not going to happen, right? But I can always pay that back because I create the currency and I can just pay it back in that 1.5 billion pounds, right? Because I create the currency, but Scotland doesn't. Scotland's a currency user like me, you, and every household. But local authorities can release retail bonds. If you're a company, which you can look at, a company basically releases a retail bond in stocks and shares. That's what the government needs to do. It's not a sovereign nation in terms of its currency operation. It's a sub-national government. So it's a really good question, Marlene, but that's not who we are. We're someone that's looking to raise 1.5 billion in investment, which is probably what someone like, like Brewdog would probably go to the retail bond market for, right? We're more Brewdog than we are Belgium, right? So yeah, countries don't do this, but their governments don't care about their non-domestic private sector either, right? But that shouldn't let our government off. Okay, our government shouldn't be saying, oh, we're not doing it because no one else does it. They should be saying, well, how do we make sure that 165 million doesn't leak out of the Scottish economy? Let's do that. And it's not difficult. And Jim and I have looked at, you could even sell the bond through the post office or through credit unions. It's not difficult. I think they've spent £7 million just coming up with how they will release this as a wholesale bond. That's £7 million of public money has already been spent to, Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or whoever. It's absolutely appalling. And it just talks to the lack of understanding, economic understanding. And I want to finish by saying we created something called Scotland's Sectorial Balances, right, which showed you where the money goes. And we just showed that the non-government domestic sector, which is households and businesses and all of us, is almost always in deficit.
We heard you talking about the sectoral imbalances at that currency weekend, and it was, I wouldn't say it didn't go in one ear out the other, because I was trying to understand it, but I just didn't understand it, to be honest.
I struggled with it.
And
I would have loved to gone into that to detail, but it's it's a very simple framework, but it's the government ministers struggle with it as well, because it completely talks against everything that they believe.
You've got a choice. You want to have a but you've got a choice. Do you give the profits to the wholesale banks, or do you set it up in a way that the profits go back into people's pockets and then that goes back into the economy? That's really easy to get your head round, and that's really the no-brainer.
Well,
isn't it? Except it doesn't seem to be a no-brainer.
No.
We've got your presentation from the Scottish Currency Group where you go into all that. It's part of the episode we did on behind the scenes at the Scottish Currency Group, so I'll link to that below if anybody wants
and watch it again, Marlene, because you said it kind of went out, because it's really clear and it's important, and that's the beauty of the sectorial balances. All the money everyone knows that the money has to come from somewhere, so if the government are not creating it, it comes from our savings, and that's austerity.
No, absolutely. I can listen to it again, because unlike Rory Stewart, I am prepared to put in more than 5 hours before I decide that it's just not worth bothering about. I've just got one question. Is the UK as a whole in the same situation about an imbalance?
On a much smaller scale. So the UK loses a few percent every year of its GDP externally.
Okay, right.
So
that's a lot of money, though, isn't it?
Yeah, we're losing about 10%. We're losing about 10%.
Yeah.
But what it also shows is that we can't keep paying money out to foreign investors, and that's the other reason. As soon as you say to any Scottish minister, FDI is bad, it's like you've pooed on the carpet. They are just not open to that at all, and that makes it really difficult when all the evidence, 11.5 billion every year leaking out of the economy, and they want to create more of that, and that's really clear in the FOI, the Freedom of Information requests that we did as well. A lot of that money that leaks out of the Scottish economy goes back to England. So that 11.5, some of it goes back to England. So if you look at the sectorial balances, not government sector, but England, and you include the government in there, it's actually not spending anywhere near as much as you think, because a lot of the profits from Scottish businesses are going back to England. So again, it shows that the UK government is spending this 90 billion in Scotland, gets most of it back. Its private sector gets most of it back. It's so hugely powerful, but no one in the Scottish government is embracing with this narrative, because it comes from a heterodox school and a heterodox understanding. It's not even economics, it's accountancy. You can't argue with this, because it's all about the figures and the flows of finance.
Yeah, that sounds like there's a really good story to tell from that. I mean, obviously you need to find the right way to tell it, of course. But anyway, look, in the meantime, I've got my homework, so I'll go off and listen to that.
Everyone else has as well.
And as usual, it's just fascinating talking to you, William. Really enjoy that. Yeah.
And we didn't even get to ask you whether you think Starmer is still going to be the Prime Minister by the time this goes out.
It's next Tuesday,
2 weeks.
Well, do you know what? I think I'm a political economist now, and I try to stick to the economy and not really talk that much about politics, because who knows what is going on. And all I would say was, if he does go, there'll just be some other centralist automaton who will be in his place doing exactly the same. And this is the merry-go-round that the establishment, or this kind of cultural elite, want us to do. They want us spending weeks on deciding if the Prime Minister should go or stay, while they are completely drawing everything out of the economy that they can, and increasingly making people's lives more miserable. And unfortunately, we all get caught up on it.
That's why we need independence.
Well, I'm going to finish by saying, and when we've spoken about this before, independence won't solve our issues in Scotland. Exactly. And my huge concern is that the administration that we have now just sees Scotland as just a little bit like England, just maybe a wee bit nicer. And we need fundamental structural change when we have independence if we want the type of society that I think most Scots want. So it is kind of independence first, and then a fair, just an economy, a society built on resilience and well-being. And I'm looking for evidence that the current perspective from the current administration will deliver that. And I really think they're challenged by a different view of the economy that doesn't fit within this kind of neoliberal, neoclassical framework that most of them have grown up with.
But that point you made about we've got an election coming, we're going to have a huge churn of MSPs. If we get a more brazen, braver, more idealistic crew in there, that could be a game changer, couldn't it?
Hopefully that'll happen.
Yeah,
I hope so. Well, thanks very much, ladies. It's always lovely to talk to you. And it sounds like I'll see you at least one day in Leith in a few weeks in.
Yes, definitely.
Great.
We'll
Okay, then.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.